Chapter 9, Part 1 of Famous Sea Fights by John R. Hale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to find out how to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Trafalgar, 1805. The closing years of the 18th century and the opening years of the 19th represent the most splendid period in the annals of the British Navy. Howe destroyed the French fleet in the Atlantic on the glorious 1st of June 1794. Nelson died in the midst of his greatest victory off Cape Trafalgar on 21st of October 1805. Little more than 11 years separated the two dates, and this brief period was crowded with triumphs for Britain on the sea. The 1st of June, St. Vincent, Camperdown, the Nile, Copenhagen and Trafalgar are the great names in the roll of victory, but the meteor flag of England flew victorious in 100 fights on all the seas of the world. Men who were officers young in the service on the day when Rodney broke at once the formal traditions of a century and the battle line of the Comte de Grasse lived through and shared in the glories of this decade of victory. A new spirit had come into the Navy. An English admiral would no longer think he had done his duty in merely bringing his well-ordered line into cannon shot of an enemy's array, and exchanging broadsides with him at half-cannon range. Nor was the occupation of a port or an island recognised as an adequate result for a naval campaign. The enemy's fighting fleet was now the object aimed at. It was not merely to be brought to action and more or less damaged by distant cannonading. The ideal battle was the close fight amid the enemy's broken line, and victory meant his destruction. The spirit of the time was personified in its greatest sailor. Nelson's battles were fought in grim earnest, taking risks boldly in order to secure great results. Trafalgar, the last of his battles, and the last great battle of the days of sail, was also the final episode in the long struggle of Republican and Imperial France to snatch from England, even for a while, the command of the sea. When Napoleon assembled the great army at Boulogne, gave it the official title of Armée d'Angleterre, and crowded every creek from Dunkirk to Havre with flat-bottomed boats for its transport across the Channel, he quite realised that the first condition of success for the scheme was that a French fleet should be in possession of the Channel at the moment his veterans embarked for their short voyage. He had 20 sail of the line under Admiral Guantam at Brest, 12 under Villeneuve at Toulon, a squadron of 5 at Rochefort under Admiral Mississi, 5 more at Ferrol and in this last port, and at Cadiz and Cartagena there were other ships belonging to his Spanish allies. But every port was watched by English battleships and cruisers. The vigilant blockade had been kept up for 2 years, during which Nelson, who was watching Toulon, had hardly been an hour absent from his flagship, the Victory, and Collingwood, in the Royal Sovereign, did not anchor once in 22 months of alternate cruising and lying to. Napoleon's mind was ceaselessly busy with plans for moving his fleets on the sea as he moved army corps on land, so as to elude, mislead and outmanoeuvre the English squadrons, and suddenly bring a concentrated French force of overwhelming strength into the narrow seas. The first move in these plans was usually assigned to the Toulon fleet. According to one project, it was to give Nelson the slip, make for the Straits of Gibraltar, combine with the Cadiz fleet in driving off or crushing the blockading squadron before that port, sail north with the liberated vessels, fall on the blockading ships before Rochefort and Brest, and then sweep the Channel with the united squadrons. In other projects, French fleets were to run the blockade simultaneously, or in succession raid the West Indies, draw for part of the naval forces of England to the other side of the Atlantic, and then come swooping back upon the Channel. In the plan finally adopted, the first move was to be the escape of the Toulon fleet, the second the threat against the West Indies, its execution entrusted to Villeneuve, because Napoleon, ever since the escape of his squadron from the disaster in Aboukir Bay, had regarded him as a lucky man. and luck and chance must play a great part in such a project. Nelson did not keep up a close and continuous blockade of Toulon with his fighting fleet of battleships. He used Sardinia as his base of supplies, and there were times when all the heavier ships were in Sardinian waters, while his frigates watched Toulon. His previous experiences had led him to believe that if the French Mediterranean fleet came out, it would be for another raid on Egypt, and this idea was confirmed by reports that Villeneuve was embarking not only troops, but large quantities of saddlery and muskets. The story of the saddles seemed to indicate an expedition to a country where plenty of horses could be obtained to mount a body of cavalry. Horses, too, that when they were bought or requisitioned would not have saddles that a European trooper was used to. Nelson did not want to keep the French shut up in Toulon. He was anxious to catch them in the open sea, and with his fleet on the coast of Sardinia and his frigates spread out in a fan to the northwards, he counted on bringing Villeneuve to action if he attempted to reach the Levant. In January 1805, the frigates brought news that the French were out, and Nelson at once disposed his fleet to intercept their expected voyage to Egypt. He found no trace of them in the direction he expected, and was greatly relieved on returning from a hurried rush eastward to learn that bad weather had driven Villeneuve back to his port. "These gentlemen," he said, "are not accustomed to the Gulf of Lyons gales, but we have buffeted them for 21 months without carrying away a spar." On 30th of March, Villeneuve came out of Toulon again with 11 ships of the line. This time, thanks to Nelson's fixed idea about Egypt, he got a good start for the Atlantic. As soon as his frigates brought the news that the French were out, Nelson strung out his ships from the south point of Sardinia to Sicily and the African coast. He thus watched every possible avenue to the eastern Mediterranean, ready to concentrate and attack the enemy as soon as he got touch of them anywhere. But not a French sail was sighted. Villeneuve had run down past the Balearic Islands to Cartagena, where Admiral Salcedo was in command of a Spanish squadron. But the Spaniards were not ready for sea, and Villeneuve was anxious to be west of the Straits of Gibraltar as soon as possible, and could not wait for his dilatory allies. On 8th of April he passed through the straits, then he steered for Cadiz, drove off Sir John Orde's blockading squadron of 6 sail, and entered the harbour on the 9th. At Cadiz there were Admiral Gravina's Spanish fleet and a French battleship, the Aigle. Again the Spaniards were mostly unready for sea, but 6 of them and the Aigle joined Villeneuve when he sailed out into the Atlantic, steering for the West Indies, now at the head of 18 battleships and 7 frigates. Information was difficult to obtain and travelled slowly 100 years ago. It was not till 11th of April that Nelson learned that Villeneuve had passed through the Straits of Gibraltar 8 days before. Then, while the French were running down into the trade wind that was to carry them westward, Nelson, still ignorant whether they were raiding the West Indies or Ireland, but anxious in either case to be in the Atlantic as soon as he might be, had to work his way slowly toward the straits against stormy headwinds, and then wait wearily at anchor on the Moorish coast for a change of wind that would carry him into the ocean. He was suffering from disappointment, depression, and ill health. It was not till 7th of May that he passed the straits. He had made up his mind that the French were probably bound for the West Indies, and he followed them. They had a long start, but he trusted to find them among the islands and make the West Indian seas once again famous for a British victory. On 4th of June he reached Barbados and began his search, only to miss the French thanks to false information, and learn too late that they were returning to Europe. Villeneuve had paid only a flying visit to the West Indies, leaving Martinique on 5th of June, the day after Nelson arrived at Barbados, and steering first north, then eastwards across the Atlantic. Nelson followed on 13th of June and reached Gibraltar without once sighting his enemy. He had, however, taken the precaution of dispatching a fast sailing brig to England with the news that the French fleet was returning to Europe. This ship, the Curio, actually got a glimpse of the enemy far off in mid-ocean, and outsailed him to such good purpose